condensed and it has a single story, but there are episodes in it, and very often in those episodes you see something very great. You get something of the poetry of the poem. This is a scene where two warriors, a very experienced Greek warrior, Diomedes, meets a Trojan, Glaucus, on the field of battle. This is how the passage goes. It's quite long, and I'm going to abbreviate it here and there, but this is the beginning of it. Glaucus, son of Hippolochus, and Diomedes, son of Tydeus, now approached one another in the space between the two armies and offered battle. When they had come within range, Diomedes of the loud war cry challenged the other. "Whom have we here?" he asked. "Give me your name, my good sir, if indeed you are a man, for I have never seen you till this moment in the field of honor. Yet in facing the long shadowed spear in my hand, you have shown far greater daring than any of your friends. The fathers of men who meet me in my fury are liable to weep. But if you are one of the immortals, come down from the sky. I am not the man to fight against the gods of heaven. Why, not even the powerful Lycurgus, Dryas' son, survived his quarrel with the gods of heaven for very long. He chased the nurses of the frenzied Dionysus through the holy hills of Nyssa, and the sacred implements dropped to the ground from the hands of one and all as the murderous Lycurgus struck them down with his ox goad. Dionysus fled and found sanctuary under the salt sea waves, where Thetis took him to her bosom, trembling and completely cowed by the man's chastisements. But the immortals, easy livers as they are, resented what he had done. The son of Cronos struck him blind, and he did not live long after that, with all the deathless gods against him. So you must not count on me if it comes to fighting with the blessed ones. But if you are one of us mortals who plow the earth for food, come on, and you will meet your doom the sooner. My gallant lord Tydides, I didn't get that right. Tydides, yes.
Yeah.
The noble son of Hippolochus replied, "What does my lineage matter to you? Men in their generations are like the leaves of trees. The wind blows, and one year's leaves are scattered on the ground. But the trees burst into bud and put on fresh ones when the spring comes round. In the same way, one generation flourishes and another nears its end. But if you wish to hear about my family, I will tell you the tale. Most people know it already." And then he proceeds to tell Diomedes the story of his life and the story of where he came from, his ancestors. And he goes on at great length. Glaucus's tale delighted Diomedes of the loud war cry. He stuck his spear into the fruitful earth, and now addressed the Lycian prince in cordial terms. "Surely," he said, "your family and mine are linked by old established ties. Aeneas, my noble grandfather, once entertained the peerless Bellerophon in his palace and kept him there for 20 days, after which they gave each other the splendid gifts that host and guest exchange. Aeneas gave his friend a belt stained with bright purple dye, and Bellerophon gave Aeneas a gold two-handled cup, which I left in my house when I set out. As for my father Tydeus, I don't remember him, as I was only a baby when he joined the Achaean expedition that came to grief at Thebes. But I have said enough. to show that in me you will now have a good friend in the heart of Argos, and I shall have you in Lycia if ever I visit that country. So let us avoid one another's spears, even in the melee, since there are plenty of Trojans and their famous allies for me to kill if I have the luck and speed to catch them, and plenty of Achaeans for you to slaughter if you can. And let us exchange our armor, so that everyone may know that our grandfather's friendship has made friends of us. With no more said, they leapt from their chariots, shook hands, and pledged each other. But Zeus, the son of Cronos, must have robbed Glaucus of his wits, for he exchanged with Diomedes golden armor for bronze, 100 oxen's worth for the value of 9. And then it goes on. Meanwhile, Hector had reached the oak tree.
The story picks up.
Resumes. It actually, this whole episode started with Hector going off. Hector leaves. He says, with this Hector of the flashing helmet went off toward the town. And then we get this little episode, and then you go back to the story. Meanwhile, Hector had reached the oak tree at the Scaean gate.
I always remember this passage because when I was a student in college, a long, long time ago, we were reading the Iliad, and I can remember a brilliant student. I think he's now dead. It's one of those things. Maybe he isn't. Maybe at this moment he's saying that same thing as me. And I was about to say he was one of those fellows who was brilliant, and everyone thought he'd come to great things, and yet you say today, gee, I wonder whatever became of him. I bet as I say, he may be sitting somewhere saying that with me. When you're an undergraduate, of course, you're always brilliant, and you always have a great future. But I can so vividly remember we were talking about the Iliad, and I don't remember what it was that came up, but that young fellow there just flashed out almost like one of the characters in the poem himself, and he said, do you know that passage in the Iliad where Glaucus comes up against Diomedes? And I didn't even remember it. See, I had read the poem on assignment, but I didn't remember this aside. And he said, where he's of course terrified. Here is Diomedes next to Achilles, the greatest warrior on the Greek side. In fact, that's the episode we're in. That is when Achilles withdraws from the battle, having quarreled with Agamemnon. Diomedes then goes on the rampage, and he takes over the whole poem for about a book. And he is just the greatest warrior there is. And this great man, in the full strength of his maturity, perhaps he's 35 years old, at the height of his prowess as a warrior. And here comes this young fellow who is maybe 18 years old, never been in battle before. In fact, Diomedes says, I've never seen you here before. Are you a god or something? And he had this young fellow had been stirred to heroic action by a speech that Hector had just given, saying, come on, you Trojans, we've got to go out there and fight. And this young fellow said, well, by golly, I'll go out and fight. And out he goes, and the first guy he runs into is the greatest warrior then on the Greek side. And of course he knows he's going to die. There's just no way that he could possibly survive a single combat with Diomedes.
Well, Diomedes he suggests that he might be a god partly because he's never seen him before, and partly because he's very impressed by this young man.
He's just so marvelous.
His appearance.
And his audacity and his
his
youth. His very youth.
The very idea that he's obviously a young man, and the very idea that he would come up in the field of battle against Diomedes.
Nobody else would.
No one else. He says that. He says, why, no one else would do this. He says, maybe you're a god, because only a god would have the audacity to do that. It is that audacity that he
It's just
admires
love.
so much.
And this young fellow that I'm reminiscing about in my undergraduate days, that's a vile phrase, college days, we weren't undergraduate. He said, that young fellow said, well, you ask me my name. And then, knowing that he was about to die, he said, the generations of men are as the generations of the leaves. And this young fellow said, and I remember it so distinctly, he said, you know, when I read those lines, I hear a hum, he said. I've never forgotten that because I think that's such a good description. You know, the music of the spheres. There's a famous image that the stars are tops and that the gods are boys who whip them. Now there's an image that goes back even before my generation. I never played whip tops. Did you ever play whip tops?
No.
That goes back to we played tops.
Yeah.
We spun them, but we wound them up and let them go on the end of a string. But in our father's generation, the kids used to play a game of tops where you had a kind of whip, and you kept them spinning and spinning and spinning by hitting them with a leather thong. But when they spun, now I can remember this, tops make a noise. Mm-hmm. They hum. In fact, you could buy a special humming top. Yeah.
Kind of a musical
one,
yeah. Holes.
The hole, yeah. And it would go, and that game goes back, as I understand it, to antiquity. That is to a what they call primordial tradition. Now, I think there is a primordial tradition. What does that word mean? Well, after all, Adam knew everything. And Adam was expelled from the garden, but he didn't forget what he knew. And he taught that to his children. And his children and his children's children taught it to their children and their children's children. Now, because of original sin, it got corrupted and got wasted, and it got less and less. But it wasn't lost. That is, what I'm saying is that outside Revelation, there is a great body of tradition that was handed down from the Garden of Eden itself. And although it was corrupted, that tradition has a kind of remnant of the truth in it. And these stories that the stars are like tops, whipped by boys, and that they hum. Now, that's true. That is, there are angels who run those stars, and there is a music of the spheres. And this young fellow was, in a way, giving a sort of personal testimony to that. That is, he said, when he read that passage, he heard a hum. And I think that's true. I think that's really true. That is, this is aside from the poem. It's not on the main line. We're not dealing with the plot. But in this little episode, suddenly Glaucus, whipped by an angel, sings, hums, gives off a kind of music when he speaks those marvelous lines. The generations of men are like the generations of the leaves. That is, he knows, facing Diomedes, that he's going to die, and he thinks about his father and his grandfather. You've asked me who I am and what my lineage is. Well,
he says, well, what difference does it make?
What difference does it make? Yeah. And yet he says, if you ask me, I'm proud of who they are. And then he recites a story. He's descended, of course, from the gods. His grandfather was Bellerophon, who plays a tremendous role in mythology. I wouldn't dare go into it. It's too complicated who he was. But he is one of the most famous of the figures of the primordial age, that is the pre-Homeric age of legend. And this young fellow says, that's who I am. And Diomedes is he hears the hum too. That is, Diomedes hears that. He says, I'm not going to kill you. You're marvelous, he says. And he puts his spear down and he says, I knew your father. And he said, let's be friends. In the midst of this terrible war, we'll exchange armor. And then Homer can't resist that joke where they exchange their armor, but poor Glaucus is so happy to be alive that he gives his armor immediately, but his is gold, and the other guy's is bronze. But I suppose I can't help recalling my own youth and being in college and thinking of that splendid young fellow who came alive at that moment, and heard that music. And as I say, I really think today he's dead. I think he is. And never became famous, as we all thought he would. Somehow, my own personal experience of that line is a little commentary on what the line means. That is, Homer is not writing about somebody else. He's writing about us, all of us. Our generations are like the leaves, and we come upon the earth, and we're green for a time, and we fall. What does it matter? Well, what matters is that home. What matters is that some moment in our lives, we do become the instrument of the gods. We do become the instrument of angels. We are caught up in a music greater than ourselves. And Glaucus, he'll just never be forgotten. There he stands.
Yes, well, it's Glaucus doesn't achieve his fame by killing anyone.
This is his greatest moment.
Yes, this is his greatest moment, and here he meets one of the greatest men on the side of the Greeks, one of the greatest warriors in the world. Second, I suppose you would say, only to Achilles, and yet he has a kind of triumph here. He rises up to the occasion and surpasses. I suppose he. We were talking. Mr. Senior was saying before we started. He was saying last week we talked about how the poem brings things down to the earth and how much of the earth this poem is, but also we were saying this passage is the other kind. We start talking about the music of the spheres when you come to a passage like this.
It brings us back up again, doesn't it? Yeah. We're right up there. Yeah.
Well, the gods, the element of the divine is mixed in, mingled in with this. He says of us mortals, he says, if you are one of us mortals who plow the earth for food, he says, come on, and you'll meet your doom.
Isn't that the way to put it?
Yeah.
We eat bread.
Yeah.
This is you see, there is a primordial tradition. In a way, we might almost say that phrase, the fruit of the earth, or we plow the earth. In this translation, he calls it the fruit. He says, but if thou art of men who eat the fruit of the field. Now, I don't know.
More literal.
It's probably more literal. And I was thinking there, that in the primordial tradition there was a knowledge of the Eucharist. There really was. That is that the bread. That's the bread and of the earth. It's there. Of course, they didn't know. I say they had a knowledge, but it's a poetic knowledge. It's an analogical, mysterious kind of knowledge, metaphorical knowledge. It's not the kind of knowledge that we now have because we know Christ and we know that He came among us and so on. They didn't, but they had a sense, a mysterious premonition,
well,
a prophetic idea that there was something about bread.
Bread and wine, bread and wine are the gifts of the gods. There is something divine in them. In those purely earthly things, there is something of the divine that they were able to see in them.
We talk in theology about the accidents again. Didn't we bring this up last time?
Well,
one time anyway.
Yeah.
That we're we're so inclined to say, oh, well, they're just accidents, as if accidents, weren't significant, weren't signs, which they are. Why is it bread? Why is it wine? We should love bread and love wine because Christ chose them as his accidents. That's a blessing beyond imagination. There is a deep mystery in these things, and Homer knew that, and Glaucon knew that, and Diomedes knew that. In this poetic mood, here these two meet in the middle of this battle. We talked last time about the domestic side of this poem, that is Hector and Andromache, and the whole story of peace, really, of the woman who wants her husband to be home and to be the father to her children. And yet we know that this is a poem about battle, and it's almost impossible to talk about that. How much of this poem takes place, like this passage too, in a side, and how little really describes the actual battle. Now Homer does describe the battle. You've got teeth knocked out, and oh boy, if you want to get heads
split open.
Homer is no respecter of sensibilities. Henry James and Homer are about as far apart as you can get. That is, Henry James is the novelist of the 20th century, who I guess is most famous for never directly describing anything. Everything is always filtered through sensibility. But Homer, he gives you close-up detail of how ghastly war is and how glorious. But still, I would say, so much of the poem takes place in these little moments when the battle rages over our heads. That is, this is one of the bloodiest scenes in the whole world. Men are hacking each other's heads off, and still they have time in the middle of the battle to talk this way to one another.
That is people are inclined to think that in war men become beasts.
Yes.
They lose all sense of their humanity and their decency and their courtesy, and they simply become savages, bloodthirsty savages. That's a lie.
These two enemies love one another. That is, there is a kind of love, a manly, love of soldiers on the other side. Which couldn't exist without the war. I mean, it brings out the imminence of death, puts us on the line. There it is on the line. Homer. I think we last time quoted General Patton as saying, "I love war."
Yeah.
Homer loves war. You do have to say that. He loves war. He knows war. That is, there's nothing of the sentimental about Homer. It's not a celebration of some sort of Gilbert and Sullivan parody of war. This is the real thing, and yet he sees that this terrible thing brings out, I'm reminded of that line of Yeats, a terrible beauty is born. That is a good line. Yeah. William Butler Yeats is a modern poet, and I don't know, I have a lot against old Yeats. He kind of a foolish genius, but that's a great line. He's a great poet. Great poet. And he was writing about the Irish rebellion against the British. He was writing, that's in a poem called Easter 1916, where he talks about the Irish rebellion, where these fellows went off and they all got killed. They hanged. They were caught by the British and they were hanged. And the chorus of the poem, he describes the revolution and he describes their battle against the British, and he names their names, and then he says, and it's a repetitive line like a kind of chorus, a terrible beauty was born. A terrible beauty was born. That's repeated after every stanza, and that's Homeric. That's Homer would say that's right.
Well, there is. Senior used the phrase "love of enemy."
Yeah, love of enemy.
Love of enemy. There it is again.
Yeah.
You say, well, that's one of those things the pagans didn't understand was love of enemy, but it's certainly not true.
It's something we don't understand.
Yeah.
Because we
don't.
We want to make them friends.
Yeah. Well,
we confuse it. We say, oh no, our enemies are really our friends.
Yeah.
Diomedes knew damn well that the Trojans were his friends, but he knew that this one he could love.
You can't really love your enemy if you don't have an enemy. And the thing is, there isn't. And when is there preeminently? When is there an enemy? Well, it's in war. That's when you really know who your enemy is, and they know each other as enemies, and they don't really cease to be enemies. But there is. Friendship, love becomes possible precisely because they're always. This has happened. This sort of thing happens in warfare, and has happened in warfare over and over and over again. This is not something novel. This is the great locus of this event, but this has been done over and over and over again. You see it even in the most common things. Two men who will get it, or even two boys who will get into a violent fight, and really knock each other around. There is a very strong likelihood that they will become friends.
That's the only way to make it. That's
the only way.
Yes, the only way.
A real possibility exists there for friendship.
Now, isn't that true? I mean, about boys. We're talking here about very young kids. What adolescents? Even.
Yeah, adolescents.
By golly, there has to be a fight. There really does. And then there is that tremendous friendship. I think that's really true. Oh, this poem it hums. It has a hum. And we've said this many times. When you read a poem, you have to read it simultaneously on several levels. Now, this image is misleading. Perhaps when you say levels, you think, well, there's the top and the bottom and the middle, and it looks like a chocolate cake. But I don't know. It's the figure that's been used, and it may be finally the only one we have. That is, this poem is about Troy, and this passage is about Diomedes and Glaucus, but it's also about you. You have to see that at the same time. You have to see that. For young people who are going to go from this kind of poetry into a serious study of the Bible, this lesson better be learned. It better be learned. And it can only be learned, I think, in this way. That is, unless you really see that you young people who are listening to this tape, that you young people are Glaucus, and that you will meet Diomedes, and that this is you yourself experiencing this. Unless you see this, you'll never have a right to start to read the Bible, which we know is about a number of things at once. When you read any story of the Old Testament, every single word of the Bible is about Christ. Every word is about Christ. If you read, a Psalm of David, it's about Christ. If you read the story of David and Goliath, if you read of Samson slaying the Philistines, it's about Christ. Every single story is about Christ, and every story is about you, too. You have to. What a sterile thing you get out of a purely theological reading of the Bible. An attempt to extract doctrine from it without that involvement of the person yourselves in it. And I don't think that can be learned except through this what do they call this? study of poetry as a prologue to theology, the handmaiden of theology.
Yes, it's exactly as you the reading of the Bible as theology is exactly like reading this poem as literature, as we so often learn to read poetry. That is, you start explaining figures of speech and talking about the background of the poem. You start trying to extract some sort of moral or some lesson from it. These are the ways that we go about trying to get something out of the poem. But what we leave out always under those circumstances is precisely ourselves.
Ourselves.
What it has to do with us.
Not making a moral out of it or a lesson out of it, but well, it's true that bad people have abused these things, but it's personal experience. Last fall, I was talking to some students about we were meeting in the afternoon for singing Vespers. There's a small group of students here who still do that after all these years. And the question came up, why do we sing Vespers? That is, why is it in the evening? Now, of course, we also have lauds, and we have, we have terce and nones, and I mean, we do sing at stated hours, several hours of the day. But let's just take this one. Why should you sing at Vespers? And I went to the Bible, and just as it were for the fun of it, I got a hold of an index, a concordance, and I looked up evening. I just said, well, this is evening. What happens in the evening? And I went through some of the references in the Old Testament to evening. And one of the earliest ones in the book of Genesis, it was maybe the third or fourth mention of the word evening. And it said, and Lot was sitting at the gates of the city at evening when two angels approached him. Now, after that follows, as we know, that terrible story about the evil men of Sodom. But I just put the book down and I said to the students, when you sing Vespers, you are sitting at the gates. That is, where are the gates between the spiritual and the material, if not in a church? That is, here we are. We're at the gates. There is the altar rail. Well, the last they took it down, but there used to be literally an altar rail there with gates, And if the angels are going to come into the city of Lawrence, they're going to descend through these gates. And here you are, like Lot. And Lot was the only one saved in the whole city. And I think it was because he was sitting at the gates, waiting for them. And he tries to save the angels, and he does, from this terrible thing that almost happened to him. But I just recall that way of reading the Bible. That is, that's why we're singing Vespers. It isn't some story out of antiquity, nor is it some proof text possibly about angels, which it is. I mean, I suppose it is. You can use it. I mean, that's another and quite proper way to read. But I think it would be a sterile way if you didn't realize that you yourself were sitting at those gates, praying there, waiting. Because if you do that, someday those angels will come to this city and they will visit it, and the city will be destroyed. I mean, all those things are still true. Well, people ask us, why don't we skip Homer and go to the Bible? And we say, no, because the lesson has to be learned here in Homer. That is, we have to have the habit of reading in this way. And I don't think there's a better passage in the whole of secular poetry than this one, this meeting between Glaucus and and Diomedes.
Yeah, well, the minute you mention the gate, you remember the Scaean gate. Is the way the next passage begins. Meanwhile, Hector had reached the oak tree at the Scaean gate and was at once besieged by Trojan wives and daughters, asking about their sons and brothers, their husbands and their friends. That there at the gate, the main gate,
the gate of Troy.
The gate of Troy.
The poem is haunted by those gates.
Yes, right.
That's where Hector's killed.
Yes. Yes, his
killed
wife, Andromache says, why don't you go somewhere, fight it at some other gate, not there, because not there at the oak tree, because that's, it has an association with death. That is the gates of life and death are there. Your imagination's immediately filled with those passages. Straight is the gate. Narrow is that gate between heaven and earth and heaven, and it does have to do with death. We keep coming back to these great themes, these great subjects of love, war, and death.
And you can't have gates without walls. The great walls of Troy, how many times they are referred to, those great walls. And when you talk about life and death, there is a wall between the two. Now, at the end of the world, there won't be, I take it. that will be where the wall will no longer exist. But that is there was no wall around the garden, was there, until the fall.
No.
And then God put a wall around it.
Yes.
Just the other day I was talking to someone about Iraq. At the moment, Iraq is in the news. The Iranian and Iraqian war, and they're blowing each other up and everything. And this young fellow was talking to me, and he said, I never knew much about Iraq, but I just happened to see a map in a newspaper, and I looked at it. And he said, where Iraq is? It's between the Tigris and the Euphrates. They have the Garden of Eden. And that's true. And you wonder, why should we bother about Iraq? Why would any... how doesn't Shakespeare have a line about, isn't that in Hamlet, about this little piece of earth, Denmark?
Denmark, yeah.
Doesn't he say it?
Oh, he's talking about that little piece of land.
Coral in a straw?
The coral, yeah. This is, what's his name? The young man who's going there to fight.
The king.
He's going there to fight. And Hamlet admires him so much because they're going to fight for this little plot of land. He says it isn't big enough to bury the dead on, and they're fighting over just this little plot of land.
You hear that so often.
Yeah.
And today people say, you hear them over the radio, isn't this ridiculous, this desert, this wasteland here, the fate of the world, after all, important things like like what? I mean, are riding in the balance, like the suburbs of Los Angeles. I mean, is that the important part of the world? Whereas this stupid little spot of desert that nobody could possibly care about, that happens to lie between the Tigris and Euphrates. And you look it up on a map, and now I've got it straight. Babylon is there. Babylon is there. The capital of Iraq is, oh dear, one of the greatest cities of antiquity. One of the very greatest. We don't follow the newspapers, and I wish I hadn't got into this now because I can't remember. But it's Nineveh. It's Nineveh.
Oh yeah.
It is. I mean, well, Nineveh is there.
Yeah,
Nineveh.
there.
No, I'm sorry, it's not the capital.
Not the capital.
But Nineveh is there, and then we think of Jonah sitting there, and thinking Nineveh was such a great city. It took 6 days.
7 days
to walk across.
Yeah.
I mean, finding coral in a straw. And then we were talking back and forth. Well, they've got Babylon, they've got Nineveh, they've got. Now it isn't Baghdad because that's Baghdad is Syria. But it's one of those great. It isn't Tyre.
No.
But Nineveh is associated with Tyre.
Yeah.
But anyway, we were naming these places, and then suddenly he said, "But that's where the Garden of Eden." They've got the Garden of Eden, and it sort of made it comic, But we're talking about this mystery. What did we say? You have to read the Bible. The Bible is about Christ. The Bible is about ourselves. It's about history. It's about the history of the world. That is, God holds the whole thing in a single hand. There it is, the beginning and the middle of the end. And the Trojan War is one of those great moments in the story of history. And we ourselves, after all, are moving into a certain chapter of history, and battles are being fought. I don't know, but maybe the plains of Armageddon are out there somewhere too, towards Syria or Iraq or Iran. This is the real history, not the history that you read in your history courses. This is God's understanding of history.
Yeah, we are so caught up. Contemporary world is so caught up in the events of today, the events that are happening right now. I never hear anyone talk about the significance of any of these events beyond this day and this
economics and
politics and
Russia
and all of the tides of the moment. This young man, Glaucus, is different.
Well,
He sees it even in connection with himself at this very moment, and the whole of this great war, this very great war, is put into a perspective of all times. He says, men in their generations are like the leaves of the trees. It's very strange. Today, a student came in to my office. He had found a passage in a book that struck him very much, and he read it to me. And one of the things in that passage was this very passage. He said this man, he was so struck because this was a scholarly book by a Shakespearean scholar, and he was saying that in our times, if a scholar says the sort of thing that we're saying right now about poetry, he said it's offensive. People are offended. They don't want to talk about the truth of these great passages. He said that, and he used this as an example. He said, it's really true. He said, you look at the trees, you look at the leaves of the trees, and if you stop and you really look at them, and you see them falling, or you see them coming green, you're very likely to think such things as how many people have died before this. We living in the contemporary world where everything has to do with right
we
now.
think we're the only ones.
We think we're the first ones to die. We're when the moment of our death comes, I'm afraid that so many people think, well, this isn't right. I'm the first one who ever died. We don't have any participation in the whole life of the world. The life, really, of the whole universe is what's involved. But we're isolated, or we tend to isolate it from that because we haven't read this passage in Homer and taken it to heart, as they say.
Now, this man you're talking about, this scholar, didn't specifically mention Homer.
No,
but obviously
he was referring to this passage. Oh,
Oh, he did. He was
Oh, yes.
specifically referring to it.
He was. He was
I-
trying to say, you know,
I
that.
see, yeah. I thought
These-
maybe he just had it in his memory, but meaning he specifically realized that it
Oh,
was,
yes.
that it was Homer.
He was pointing out that people in literary circles just say, "Oh, well, that's just a literary reference." You know?
Sure.
That's a literary. Oh, I see. You're making a literary allusion. He says, "No,
No,
he
no,
says,
no.
He says that's really true." He said that passage is really true. That the generations of men really are like the leaves of the trees. You think of all the trees on the earth, and you think of all the leaves that fall every year.
Well, if you remember nothing else from the poem, that one passage would make the Iliad worth it. The whole poem would be worth just a single aside like that. You know, I think last time I was talking about this relation between substance and accident, that sometimes you almost get the idea that it's backwards. Now, I don't want to go that far. I just want to say it in order to get the idea across. But sometimes you almost think that the whole purpose of the poem is just to write that passage. That is, as if something accidental were the real reason for the substance. Now, I don't think that's true, but I think it gives you an insight into the truth. After all, in life itself, we remember things like birth and baptism and confirmation and graduation in the secular order. We commemorate birthdays, we commemorate confirmation days or first communion days. We have reunions of our high school graduations and our college graduations.